Mr. David Rubin, welcome to Sweden.
Tack så mycket.
Good. You're learning Swedish fast, I suppose. Could you introduce yourself to the spectators? Could you introduce yourself to the Swedish audience?
Yes, I'm originally from the United States of America. I've been living in Israel for 22 years. I had the privilege of serving my community of Shiloh as mayor. This was in the community of Shiloh, where the capital of Israel once stood. The capital of ancient Israel stood in Shiloh for 369 years, in the time of Joshua and Hannah and Samuel the prophet, yes. And of course then after Shiloh, it went on for several hundred years to Jerusalem as the capital. And after serving my community as mayor, a year and a half later, my 3-year-old son and I were wounded in a terrorist attack by Islamic terrorists who were shooting from the side of the road. These were terrorists of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, the Fatah terrorist organization of the Palestinian Authority. This happened to us. We suffered from this for about 2 years. Thank God the bullet that went into my son's head missed his neck by 1 millimeter.
So you can say he's miraculously survived.
It was a miraculous survival. The car wasn't even starting. Finally, the car started, and we got away from the terrorists. A couple of operations and some months of psychological, emotional therapy for my son for post-trauma. And I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund for the purpose of healing the trauma of terror victim children and rebuilding the biblical heartland of Israel, Israel's historic heartland, which is Samaria and Judea, the area that much of the world calls by the modern fictional term the West Bank.
Well, that term is, of course, only a result of the partition of this country, whether you call it Palestine or Israel. But to return to your work, to aid children that suffer from, post-trauma syndromes after violent actions and violent activities, one could perhaps almost say that you've been consecrating your time to aiding these people, or is that a too pompous word?
No, I think, well, as long as you're saying it and I'm not saying it, it has indeed become a mission for me, and I've dedicated my life to helping these children who've suffered so much. And we know thousands of children who have suffered from the terrorism. Emotionally, psychologically. Obviously, there are many who've suffered physically and have been shot and wounded themselves or have lost parents. But I'm speaking about the psychological trauma.
Mr. Rubin, I like to return to other aspects of your career. You were an English teacher back in the US. So this reflects some of your work in Israel. You're a very prolific writer. We have here on the table 3 books that you have written. Would you give a short introduction to each one of them?
I could add. I was a teacher, a full-time teacher for almost 25 years. I didn't expect it to prepare me. I wasn't doing it to prepare for what eventually happened to us. But the terrorism indeed changed my life. And after that, and once I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund and started with my work for the children, I started to get invited to speak to many places around the world to tell my story, to tell the story of Israel, and to tell the story of the return to the heartland of Israel. And that's when I wrote my first book, which is called God, Israel, and Shiloh, Returning to the Land, which tells the story of the journey of Israel from slavery in Egypt all the way to the conquest of the land originally 3,300 years ago, and all of the challenges that we've had in our time from the persecution living around the world in other countries, and the eventual return to the land, and our struggle, the valiant struggle, I might add, of those people who live in the heartland of Israel against all of the terrorists that we faced.
One could perhaps say this is a very historic book, both ancient and contemporary history.
It's historic, but it's also personal.
Personal. It's personal. It's your personal interpretation.
It is my personal story of my personal return to my people and my land, as well as the return of Israel to its land.
Okay. Your other two recent books, they are dealing more with modern times.
The current events.
The current events. In this case, even the title tells us that.
Yes, the Islamic Tsunami, Israel and America in the Age of Obama. It speaks about the Islamic threat to Western civilization, the attempts through terrorism and through more silent, seemingly non-aggressive attempts to change Western civilization from a Judeo-Christian civilization to a predominantly Islamic civilization. That's what this book speaks about. And of course, my most recent book, which is Peace for Peace, Israel in the New Middle East.
That title, Peace for Peace, is that an intentional play on words?
Well, it actually was more, it turned out to be a play on words that actually rhymes. But the point is that for 50 years now, Israel has been banging its land for peace head against the wall, or I should say being forced to bang its land for peace head against the wall by various nations in the world. And the point is that Israel cannot make peace by taking its tiny country, which is maybe a fifth of the size of Sweden, and taking that area, handing over its heartland of that area where all of its raison d'etre, all of its historic places are located, and to hand it over to an armed band of Islamic terrorists, which the Palestinian Authority is. You can't do that and have peace.
Well, Mr. Mudar Zahran, from Jordania, or should I say from the so-called West Bank? You're Palestinian?
Yes, my parents are from Jerusalem, originally.
You are a refugee in the UK, United Kingdom, Great Britain. You're a refugee from Jordania. Could you tell our spectators, our audience, who you are shortly, briefly?
I am a Palestinian Jordanian political leader. Not there is any difference actually between both the term Palestinian and Jordanian. I also have been advocating civil rights and human rights for the 88% Palestinian majority in Jordan under the Hashemite apartheid regime in Jordan, which does not allow us even a driver's license in our own country. Imagine if you were not allowed a government job in Sweden, your own country. And just because I've been advocating that for a few years, I ended up with a life sentence of hard labor by the king's...
3 years?
No, 25 years.
Oh.
Life sentence. Life sentence. And it's in hard labor just because I've criticized the king. And
that is not allowed in Jordania?
It's a crime, just same way with if you criticize the king of Sweden 1,000 years ago. Only that coming from a Palestinian,
it's even worse, I suppose.
It's even worse because the Hashemites are not a Jordanian or Palestinian family. They are foreigners who came from Saudi Arabia, and they rule in our country, which was the original partition between us and the Jews. They got 22% of the British mandate to Palestine. We got 78%, which is Jordan. And instead of getting our country, the Hashemites have taken our country away. And I, in my capacity as a political leader, believe peace will be fulfilled when we have our own country and we have two states between us, one in Israel and one in Jordan, with the river Jordan in between as the natural borders. It's not going to work any other way. I also have I came to Sweden with a little grudge against the media in general, and particularly the leftist media that rarely covers the incredible crime against humanity taking place in Jordan against the majority of Palestinians. If they care for the Palestinians, I'm just curious why they are so consumed with the Palestinians in the West Bank, or the so-called West Bank, while they ignore 6.4 million Palestinians suffering in Jordan.
Mr. Zahran, could we sort of return a little to your personal life and career after the problem with the Jordanian government and the Hashemite dynasty, the King Abdullah? What did it result? Did you have to flee immediately to the Great Britain, or did you go somewhere else first?
I had to flee to as soon as possible to the UK, and it was Easter. The only flights were through Egypt. And you had to stay in Egypt for 2 weeks, which was enough time for the Jordanian intelligence to collect me from Egypt. And to even make things worse, it's quite a tragedy. We had the Iceland volcano in 2010, which blocked. And there I was watching TV, knowing that if the volcano stretches any further and bans me from traveling to the United Kingdom, the Jordanians would get to me eventually. So it was a very terrifying situation. Me and my family, we did not deserve to go through this. We don't deserve the fact that I can't see my parents. I am a living example of how the Palestinians are treated in Jordan.
But you have not been allowed to live in peace in the UK. Your opponents, what I say, your enemies follow you there, do they?
Absolutely, absolutely. Threats, terror, you name it. We've seen it all. We've seen it all, and there has been one clear assault attempt. I mean, like an assault where I escaped narrowly by someone, I'm not reluctant to say his name, Samir Muashir, one of the chief executive of the Jordanian airline. And he simply tried to hurt me and threatened to kill me in a public place. And this shows you what kind of king of Jordan is. He's not peaceful, he's not moderate, he's not democratic. Even though he and his wife show up for the wedding of the Crown Prince of Sweden, they're everything but a modern royal family. They are dictators.
But do you have an understanding for the fact that the Jordanians, whether they have the Bedouin Saudi Arabic origin, or whether they are Palestinians from both sides of the Jordan River, that they can consider your views and your ideas about peaceful solutions with the State of Israel, with the accommodation with Israel? Do you have an understanding that it could be considered as a treason from their point of view?
I disagree, because there has been enough evidence. A Yale University professor did a recent study. He's an Arab, so-called Bedouin or East Banker, showing only 8% of the Palestinian majority in Jordan would like to execute the so-called right of return. And also a U.S. embassy in Amman, cable leaked by WikiLeaks, showed that the majority, actually all Jordanian Palestinian leaders in Jordan would exchange civil rights and human rights for the so-called right of return. This has been 70 years old, this matter. Most people would not move. The chance of us leaving Amman and going back to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa is the same chance of the Moroccans and the Africans and the others who came to Sweden 50 years ago picking up and going back to their countries. It's not going to happen. No. It's just common sense. Everyone has been beating the drum of that Israel is apartheid, and at the same time they're beating the drum that the King of Jordan is a moderate. How ironic. A democracy is an apartheid and a dictator is being called an ironic. Honestly, I'm afraid I've come to a conclusion that the media and the others working the powers that be in the West either just hate Jews or simply extremely ignorant.
So whatever the ideological, religious, or even judicial reasons behind the problem are, you are advocating a kind of pragmacy. Do I read you correctly? Do I understand you correctly?
Absolutely.
Pragmatism.
Absolutely.
Because you can't remove these people that wouldn't recognize the so-called original homeland.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. The realities are forcing themselves, and I have news for everyone. The King of Jordan is in his weakest state. The Hashemite regime is in its weakest state since it's been established 90 years ago. And we are actually possibly, sooner or later, could be tomorrow, could be in 2 years, maybe 3 years the most, watching a fall of the King of Jordan. And then the majority is going to elect a Palestinian president, and we're going to have a Palestinian state for the first time.
But especially from a Swedish point of view, you are something of a very sort of, how should I say, strange being, a Palestinian leader that advocates an accommodation, a settlement with Israel.
Because we in Jordan have every day, while people in Washington and London and Stockholm and Brussels theorize about peace, we are at the hitting end of the stick in Jordan. We are afraid to go to the police to report a robbery because we're afraid we're going to get tortured. We are afraid to being stopped while we're driving by the police because they're going to take the car and possibly beat up the driver if he's a Palestinian. We going through all of this. We've come to a point where even my friends keep telling me from our political circle and even the other political circles, they keep telling me that anything is better than this. We've hit the bottom. Anything else would be better.
Anything would be better. Thank you, Mr. Zahran, for sharing your views with the Swedish audience. And I think this is interesting to a lot of Swedes to meet a Palestine leader with totally different views from what we expect them to have.
Keep your eyes on Jordan. You will see major changes that are going to change the map of the area very soon.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Rubin, or David, as I should call you, and Zahran, Mudar Zahran, you're one Israelite, or you are one Palestinian, Jordanian, touring Sweden together, and you give lectures. Is that correct? Since
Yes.
about a week, or?
We've been doing it for a week, yes.
Yeah, a week. What institutions or schools, where have you been lecturing?
Well, we've spoken in a number of churches. We've spoken to a youth group as well, and we're speaking to the media, obviously, as well. We think it's important to reach as many people as we can with this important message. It's actually very interesting because we did not know each other until 1 week ago.
Is that true?
Yes.
How was it arranged then?
Well, we had a Skype meeting, and we spoke on the internet briefly, but we did not know each other personally. This is the first time that we have met, and the truth is, it has really been a pleasure. Obviously, he's coming from a slightly different perspective than I am. But we found that while there may be some differences I would say 85 to 90% of the issues we're in agreement. And if our two political views would come to the fore in Israel and with its neighbors, then I think that an accommodation could be reached. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but I really believe that the understanding that of the need for a peace agreement that includes Israeli sovereignty from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, that is the only peace plan that could possibly work. The Palestinian Authority is a corrupt terrorist authority, and there cannot be an agreement with such a violent, hateful force. But there can be an agreement with the inhabitants of the region.
The aim, the purpose of this tour, what is it? Could you answer that?
Well, I need to explain that when this started, it was not the arrangement of two people who agreed to tour the country. It was actually, the original poster was a face-off. We were expecting us to disagree and to even to argue, okay? and was asked about my temper, if I would get angry and start hitting people. No.
But you avoided that, I hope.
No, it didn't happen. Not today.
It didn't happen.
Well,
not today, but
not
yesterday.
today. Maybe in the future.
Okay.
But the thing is, what we're seeing today is a Palestinian leader, a right-wing nationalist leader. You're talking to someone on the extreme right, Mudar Zahran, and someone on the alleged extreme right of the Israelis, him.
Yeah.
And suddenly the right-wingers are agreeing.
Do I have the right to interrupt you shortly, gentlemen? Because I think, I got my mic here. Thank you still all the same. I think this is a funny thing that should be observed. From Swedish point of view, if there are extreme Israeli nationalists, they're called right-wing. But extreme nationalist Palestinians are called left-wing. Do you have any comment on that?
Also,
I find that ironical.
Well, Palestinian haters are called extremists, while Israel haters are called liberals. So it's the same story.
Yeah. Your comment, David?
Yes, I think we need to focus on those who hate and those who love. I mean, what the so-called settlers of Judea and Samaria and Eastern Jerusalem are all about is love, where people who are seeking to raise their families in the historical heartland of Israel. Nobody is looking to hurt anybody. We haven't displaced anybody. If you come to Samaria, you'll see a lot of empty hills and a lot of open spaces, and every Jewish community that was built is built in the historical land of Israel, and not one Arab village has been displaced. So a lot of what you hear is fictions from the real haters, which are on the far left in Israel, and are the Islamic ideologues that are seeking to push their terrorism on the people in the world who only want to live peacefully. And I know many Arabs in Samaria, and they tell me privately that they would just like to live their lives, and that the Palestinian Authority will not let them. The Hamas and the Fatah terrorist organizations that comprise that Palestinian Authority, they will not let them live their lives in peace.
I'd like to comment there that your answer here, that the question to contravene, to defend oneself and defend the nation against these haters, both ethnical groups, is love. Because I seem to remember, if I read it on your site, that after being exposed to this terrorist action where both you and your son were wounded and your son almost lost his life, you decided to retaliate, but not retaliate with hate or violence, but with love and understanding and compassion.
Right. My response to the evil of terrorism was to create the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, which serves to heal the trauma of terrorism in children. And we are open to all children who suffer from terrorism and need healing. So yes, it was a response that could have reasonably been with anger, or could have reasonably been with depression, but my response was to respond with love and healing, and that's why I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And actually, if anybody wants to find out more, they can go to shilohisraelchildren.org and find out exactly how it all started.
Thank you. To return to Jordania and the Palestinians, how do you keep in contact with the opposition now when you're forced to hide in the UK?
In today's world with the internet and social media, nothing is actually far. And I mean, always Skype is the main medium, and there's also, we've been creating complicated way of them connecting to me over Facebook and otherwise. And it's also more dangerous to the regime in my case because it's like a preacher. You know, when I say something, people who follow me don't, and the followers accept the idea without necessarily talking to me. Like, it's the ideology. You kill a person, you kill Mudar Zahran, like the king has been trying, obviously. You kill him, and you kill one person, but you won't kill the other.
You don't kill the ideas, the ideology.
In fact, you make him a martyr, and that would work even better.
Yeah, and there's comparison, especially on the Muslim side in the Middle East. There are many great personalities that have been in exile for many years, decades, thinking about Iran and so on.
Well, our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, was in exile in Medina when he went into the Mecca conquest. So was Lenin. He was in exile.
In
so
Switzerland
was
and so on.
not good examples maybe in Khomeini. Khomeini was in exile. So the man coming from the liberator, coming from exile, is quite a common story.
It's quite a
All
common
we
story.
want is a free, liberal, secular state for the Palestinians where it belongs, with a friendly relationship with everyone. We don't need the expensive king who has been preaching terrorism and hatred. We don't need the terrorist organization called the Palestinian Authority.
Thank you. There have been many comments from your opponents, of course, that, but you probably, you know, they're indicating treason or things, but in your point of view, I suppose you think it's unfair, or how would you comment that they are accusing you of treason, more or less?
Well, it's usually you identify a person by who his enemy is.
Yeah.
My enemy is the king of Jordan. He's been accusing me of treason, etc. So if the king of Jordan is accusing me of treason, and he is the enemy, public enemy number one in Jordan, he's the one who has been we have now in Jordan 165,000 cases of dwarfism in children. They can't find enough food. While our king flies 2 airplanes to Stockholm to have a weekend with his family. 2 airplanes. So you figure people hate the king. I am the enemy of the king through peaceful, legitimate means. So that's enough testimony. All I
Thank you. Jan, just one final question before the interview is terminated. Mr. Rubin, David, you had an article, I think, was it in December 2013 in the Jerusalem Post, where you wrote about your last book and a peace plan?
Well, I've had quite a number of articles.
Yeah, article, but there was a recent one where you discussed the process of making Arabs Israeli citizens.
I have discussed that quite a bit, and I've written many articles about that.
But there was a recent article
in the Jerusalem Post.
Has received some criticism, because you had a 3-point program how to make Israeli citizens of Palestinians, Jordanians on the so-called West Bank, or on the West Bank.
No, that's actually not correct. The plan has 3 basic points. One is that that there should be Israeli sovereignty from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River.
Yeah. Okay.
As Mr. Zahran is
but your
suggesting.
prerequisites for
the second plan, the second point in the plan, is that all residents of Judea and Samaria, the so-called West Bank, should be offered a path to loyal citizenship in the state of Israel.
Okay, but that's it. Your description of it is that it's a path to loyal citizenship. All rather have considered it as a very long and harsh and difficult way before they can qualify. 2-3 years of study of Jewish religion, Zionism, and
long and harsh are adjectives that aptly describe the torture in the Palestinian Authority and the terrorism that they inflict on civilians. What I'm talking about is a reasonable path to loyal citizenship. No free country has an obligation to have people living within its borders that are hostile and want to overthrow that country.
Well, one could understand your concern for that, but
what I propose is a course in Zionist Jewish history and civics, and an oath of loyalty to the State of Israel and national service, just like every other citizen has to perform. That's not unreasonable.
Thank you, David Rubin, Mudar Zahran. And thank you once again, gentlemen, for granting me this interview. And I wish you all luck with the rest of your tour here in Sweden.
Well,
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.